The wind carried the scent of pine and cold ash through the valley that night. Snow clung to the timberline, and the world seemed locked between the dying embers of winter and the slow promise of spring. Out on the wide Wyoming plain, a single light flickered from a cabin window, the only sign of life for miles. Inside, a rancher sat by the fire, his face worn by the kind of years that carve more than wrinkles. They carve silence. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 days, and maybe that was the way he liked it. Until he heard the horse. It came, faint at first, just a dull thud through the snow-crusted earth, then clearer, the uneven rhythm of hooves fighting exhaustion. He reached for the rifle resting against the wall, the wood polished smooth from years of use. The rancher didn't trust strangers this far west. No one should have been riding, at this hour, not through the valley where even wolves stayed hidden after dark. He pushed aside the curtain and peered into the night. The moonlight fell over a lone figure slumped in the saddle, swaying with each step of the weary animal. The rider wasn't white. That much was clear by the braids, the beads, and the dark skin glinting against the pale snow. The rancher's jaw tightened. His hand hovered on the rifle's trigger, torn between instinct and conscience. For 15 years, he'd lived with the ghost of war. Apache raids, burned homesteads, neighbors buried under stones without names. The land remembered it all. And yet, the rider looked half dead, his body leaning lifelessly to one side. The horse stopped at the edge of the porch and gave a broken whinny. The rancher opened the door, shotgun still in hand. The rider lifted his head weakly. Their eyes met, one filled with suspicion, the other with pain. The man tried to speak but fell, collapsing into the snow like a cut tree. Blood darkened the white beneath him. The rancher cursed under his breath and stepped out into the biting cold. "You'll freeze out here," he muttered, hauling the man's limp frame over his shoulder. Inside, he laid him near the hearth, close enough for the heat to reach but not enough to burn. The man's skin was feverish, his side soaked in blood. An arrowhead wound, old, but festering. He was dying. The rancher didn't ask who shot him. He didn't ask why an Apache was this far north alone. He just did what a man does when another life is slipping away. He boiled water, tore strips from a clean rag, and poured whiskey over the wound. The man groaned, his breath ragged and shallow. By dawn, the stranger stirred. His voice was rough, his English broken. "You help enemy?" he rasped. The rancher didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, remembering the night his wife had begged him to show mercy to a wounded soldier long ago, and how mercy had cost him everything. He'd sworn never to help again, never to open his door to the world. Yet here he was, watching a man he should have left in the snow, sharing his fire with the one he'd been taught to hate. The cabin filled with uneasy silence. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the air was still heavy. The Apache's eyes drifted to a faded photograph on the mantel. A woman with a soft smile, holding a small boy in her lap. He noticed how carefully it was placed, dusted clean despite the rest of the cabin being worn. "Your family," the man whispered. "Used to be," the rancher said. For a long while, neither spoke. The flames crackled, the kettle hissed, and the night retreated behind pale morning light. The rancher brought the man a tin cup of water. "Drink slow," he said, his voice low, reluctant to sound like kindness. The Apache obeyed, though every swallow seemed to drag pain through his ribs. He nodded in thanks. Then, after a moment, he said something the rancher didn't expect. "White men took my fire last winter, burned my village. Now you share yours." The words landed like stones. The rancher shifted in his chair, uneasy. "I didn't do that," he said. The man nodded weakly. "All men same when hate fills heart." The rancher didn't reply. He just poked at the fire, sending sparks into the chimney. He wanted to hate this man, to see in him the faces of those who'd taken everything he'd loved. But something about the stranger's eyes stopped him. They weren't proud or wild. They were tired, the kind of tired only loss can carve. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the ridge. The snow glittered gold for a moment before the wind stirred again. The rancher poured himself coffee, then another for the wounded man. He slid it across the floor. "You'll rest a day or two," he said quietly. "Then you ride on. No trouble, no questions. The Apache nodded, though the look in his eyes said he knew better. A man in his state wouldn't last a mile. Through the morning, the rancher went about chores, feeding the horse, chopping wood, checking the traps along the frozen creek. But his mind kept circling back to the man inside. He didn't know what kind of enemy he'd brought into his home. A scout? A raider? Or just another soul trying to survive a land that had no mercy for anyone? When he returned, the man was awake, sitting by the fire with the blanket over his shoulders. His gaze was steady, watching the rancher with quiet gratitude. "You fight once," he said softly, tapping his chest. "Here. Still fighting?" The rancher's eyes narrowed. "Every day." There was no judgment in the Apache's face, only understanding. He reached into the pouch around his neck and pulled out a small token, woven fibers and beads tied with sinew. He placed it on the table. "For peace," he said simply. The rancher stared at it for a long time. The gesture felt too heavy, too strange, like a wound trying to heal before the bleeding stopped. "Keep it," he muttered, turning away. As the hours passed, the storm outside thickened again. The sky turned gray, and a restless wind pressed against the walls. The two men sat in silence, the fire their only common ground. And as the day faded, something in the rancher's chest began to shift. He didn't know if it was forgiveness or loneliness, maybe both. By nightfall, the stranger's breathing had steadied. The rancher laid another log on the fire and stared into the flames until his eyes burned. He thought about the war, about the graves on the hill behind his land, about the choice he'd made that morning. He wondered what his wife would have said if she'd seen him now. Then, just before dawn, the Apache stirred again, eyes half open. "They come," he whispered. The rancher frowned. "Who?" The man's hand trembled as he pointed toward the window. "My brothers." The rancher froze. He could already hear it, the faint drumming of hooves rolling across the valley. He snatched his rifle from the wall and blew out the lantern. The glow of sunrise began to break the horizon, spreading red and gold across the snow. The Apache struggled to sit up, clutching his side. "They not know," he said weakly. "They think I die. They come for blood." The rancher's heart pounded. He stepped to the window. Far out on the plain, shadows moved, 5 riders painted and armed. He turned back toward the wounded man, caught between the fire and the fear creeping in with the dawn. He'd shared his warmth with an enemy. Now, as the sun rose, he was about to find out what that mercy would cost him. The rancher stood still by the window, the rifle tight in his hands, his breath slow but heavy. The riders were still distant, just dark shapes against the snowy plain. Yet every beat of their horses carried a promise of trouble. His cabin wasn't made for a fight, just thick logs stacked by his own hands long ago when peace still seemed possible. Now that peace hung by a single thread, the wounded man sitting near his fire, the one who had brought his enemies to his doorstep. He turned back toward him. The Apache's face was pale, slick with sweat, but his eyes were clear. He wasn't afraid, at least not in the way most men would be. There was something else in his look, something like regret. "They think white man kill me," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "They come to burn." The rancher's heart sank. He'd built this home from nothing, laid every beam, carved every post, and buried his wife and son under the hill behind it. He'd already lost enough to fire once before. "You brought them here," he said, his tone hard but quiet. The Apache lowered his gaze. "I did not call them. They follow trail. They see blood." The rancher looked toward the window again. The riders were closer now, riding in a slow circle, studying the cabin from afar. He counted 5, maybe 6. Their ponies moved with the same patience as wolves before a kill. His mind went back to a winter 15 years ago, the one that had changed everything. He'd been younger then, filled with fire and pride. The government had sent troops west to push the tribes into reservations, and he had ridden with the volunteers from town, thinking it was the right thing to do. His own ranch had been burned once by raiders, his wife barely saved from the smoke. In those days, hate had been easy, but war didn't stay clean for long. He still saw flashes of it at night. The villages in flames, the screams carried on wind that smelled of cedar and blood. That was when he'd walked away from everything, settled alone in this valley, and swore never to raise his hand again unless the fight came to his door. Now it had. The Apache spoke again, his words slower, like each one took strength. If I go out, they stop. They see me alive. You step outside, you won't make it 10 feet, the rancher said. You can't even stand. The man leaned back against the wall, his hand pressed to the bandage on his ribs. Better I die than you burn, the rancher didn't answer right away. His eyes traced the cabin, the saddle by the door, the photograph on the mantel, the rifle in his grip. The fire crackled, sending soft light over the walls, and for a moment it felt like the ghosts of his past were watching. He moved to the door and looked out again. The riders had stopped now, dismounting near the edge of the cottonwoods. One raised a hand, motioning toward the cabin. The rancher's stomach tightened. He knew the look of men readying for a fight. He could feel the tension in the air, the kind that made the crows go silent. You ever kill a man? He asked without looking back. The Apache's eyes flicked toward him. Many, he said simply. Long ago, the rancher nodded once. Then you know what's coming. He set down the rifle for a moment and pulled his old revolver from the drawer beside the table. It was an old Colt, the bluing worn thin, the grip dark with age. He checked the chamber, found it still loaded. His hands were steady. They'd been steady through worse. The Apache tried to speak again, but his words turned to a cough. The rancher poured a bit of whiskey in a cup and handed it to him. Save your breath, he said. You're gonna need it. Outside, the horses moved again, slow at first. Then one rider broke from the group and started toward the cabin. The others stayed back, waiting. The man rode close enough that the rancher could see the white paint streaked across his face, the feathers braided in his hair. He stopped 10 yards from the porch and called out in a voice that carried through the cold air. White man, you have one of ours. The rancher stepped to the door but didn't open it. He's alive, he shouted back. Wounded but alive. There was a long pause. The rider tilted his head, squinting through the rising light. Bring him out. He won't make it, the rancher said. He needs time. The rider's hand tightened on the reins. You speak of mercy, he said sharply. But your kind never brings mercy. The rancher could see it now. The same rage he'd once carried. The same fire that had burned his own world down. He wanted to shout that he wasn't their enemy, that war had already taken enough from both sides. But words meant little between men who'd buried too many. The Apache inside called out weakly, his voice breaking through the tension. He said something in his language, short, raw, filled with weight. The rider froze. The rancher didn't understand the words, but their meaning was clear. The man on the horse slowly dismounted, eyes fixed on the cabin door. He said something back in the same tongue, then turned to the others and raised his hand. They lowered their weapons slightly, but the air still trembled with unease. The rancher let out a slow breath. Maybe there was still a chance. He turned to the wounded man. What did you tell him? The Apache gave a faint, weary smile. That you saved my life. The rancher stared at him for a long moment. And that stopped them? For now, the man said. But sunrise brings choice. They not trust easy. The rancher looked through the window again. The riders were talking among themselves, their movements sharp and uncertain. They were deciding whether to believe or burn. The light was rising fast, painting the snow in gold and red, and with it came the sound of the creek melting, the sound of the earth waking from winter. But the air still felt like a loaded gun. Inside, the rancher poured more wood on the fire and sat across from the stranger. You got a name? He asked. The Apache nodded slowly. They call me Tohani, he said. Means born of the earth, the rancher gave a faint grunt. Fitting name for a man bleeding on my floor. Tohani's lips twitched, almost a smile. And you? Used to be called a lot of things, the rancher said. Now I just keep to myself. Tohani studied him. You lost someone, he said softly. That's why you live alone. The rancher's eyes flicked toward the mantel. The photograph caught the firelight again. The woman, the boy. Yeah, he said quietly. Lost everything worth keeping. For a while neither spoke. The fire filled the silence with soft cracks and low sighs. Outside, the riders began to move again, circling wide around the cabin, watching for signs of deceit. The rancher knew he had to decide soon, trust in the man he'd saved or prepare for the worst. As the morning stretched on, the tension in the air refused to break. He watched Tohani drift between fever and exhaustion, his lips moving as if whispering to ghosts. At times he spoke in his own tongue, low and rhythmic like a prayer. The rancher couldn't understand. but the sound carried something ancient, something that reached past anger. Then, as noon neared, a sound came from outside, the cry of an eagle overhead echoing across the valley. Tohani opened his eyes at once. "It is a sign," he murmured. "My people wait for word." The rancher didn't believe much in signs, not anymore. But even he felt something shift in that moment. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. He stood, walked to the door, and stepped onto the porch. The snow had melted in patches, revealing dark soil beneath. The riders stood in a half-circle now, their faces painted with red streaks, their eyes sharp. The leader spoke again. "We will not wait forever." The rancher raised his hand. "He needs more time. You want him alive? Let me finish what I started." The leader's gaze burned into him. "If you lie, we take your fire, your land, your blood." The rancher nodded. Fair enough. They didn't move for a long time. Then finally, the leader gave a single nod and backed away, motioning to his men. They retreated toward the trees, leaving the cabin surrounded but untouched. The rancher watched them go, then turned back inside. Tohani's eyes were closed again, his breathing shallow. The rancher knelt beside him. "They're giving us time," he said. "You better make it worth it." Tohani opened his eyes slowly. "At sunrise they test you," he whispered. "If your heart true, they know. If not, death," the rancher frowned. "Test me, how?" But Tohani didn't answer. His eyes drifted shut again, lost to fever and pain. The rancher sat back, the weight of those words sinking into him like cold water. Outside, the sky began to dim again, and the valley settled into uneasy stillness. He didn't know what kind of test was coming, but he knew one thing. By the next sunrise, everything he'd built, everything he'd buried, would either burn again or find a reason to live. The afternoon passed like a held breath. The cabin felt smaller with every hour, the fire's warmth turning heavy as worry climbed the walls. The rancher worked in steady motions, boiling more water, checking the bandage, measuring out the last of the flour for biscuits he barely touched. He listened to the valley the way a man listens for his name inside a storm. Every crunch of ice outside made his shoulders tighten. Every whisper in the flue sounded like a footstep. Tohani woke in turns, his words clearer now, though his strength ran thin. He told the rancher pieces of his trail, not as a confession but as a roadmap of trouble. He had spoken against a young war chief who wanted to raid the freight road, had tried to talk of rest and patience while winter still held the bones of their people. There had been arguments around their smoky fires. Old grief stirred into something eager for blood. He had left to ease anger and to scout for strays who had gone chasing whiskey and guns around the stockade near town. Someone tracked him. The arrow took him near the foothills. He rode blind after that, following the moon across frozen grass until the horse chose the cabin light. "You think your own shot you," the rancher said. Tohani's eyes met his with a tired honesty. "Maybe not my own. Maybe a boy who thinks war is a song that never stops. Maybe a man paid in coins from your town." He paused. "Mercy is not a safe trail, for you or for me." The rancher kept his face still, but the idea settled deep in him. A man paid in coins from town. There were men who would do it. He thought of the freight boss down by the depot, a sharp dealer who treated the prairie like a ledger. He thought of a deputy whose grin never reached his eyes. He thought of the way fear sold quick in winter. Near sunset, he saddled his old roan and stepped onto the porch with slow hands raised toward the cottonwoods. The riders watched him from the shadows, painted faces steady. The leader took a step out and called a few words that felt like a question. The rancher tapped his chest, pointed at the roan, then at town, then made a circle with his hand to mean return. He kept his movements plain so nothing could be mistaken. The leader nodded once, then lifted 2 fingers, as if setting the hourglass. The test at sunrise still waited. The rancher rode with the cold pressing through his coat. The creek beside him ran dark under a skin of ice. He stayed to the lower ground, not wanting to draw the rider's suspicion, and he prayed the roan's hooves would hold on the banked snow. Behind him, the cabin window shone like a small star. With distance, he understood how alone it really was. 5 miles on, the road turned hard, and the valley opened toward town. The little place lay against the rail like a sleeping animal, a line of false fronts and smokestacks, a church spire that scraped the dimming sky. He kept to the back lane, tied the roan near the blacksmith, and stepped into the general store where lamplight painted the counters with gold. The owner, a woman with gray hair pinned tight, looked up. "You're a sight," she said. "Creek ice on your boots and a face like bad news." He bought coffee, salve, and a small bag of oats for the tired horse. He asked after rumors without asking directly. Folks talked easy when they were cleaning counters and counting nails. A freight wagon had gone missing 2 nights ago. A patrol had found boot tracks near the hills, then lost them in the wind. A cowboy swore he'd seen riders north of the cottonwoods at dawn, and swore louder after the whiskey turned his memory brave. The deputy had been asking if anyone had seen an injured Indian around. The owner sniffed. That deputy asks too many questions about the dead and not enough about the hungry. Across the street, the church door opened and the preacher came out with a lantern. He knew the rancher by sight and nodded. "Haven't seen you at service in some years," he said. "Been busy," the rancher answered. The preacher's face softened. "Busy can be a refuge and a prison." The rancher asked about the missing wagon, about trouble near the freight road, about drifting boys who admired rifles more than bread. The preacher sighed through his scarf. A few ranch hands had fallen in with a gambler who'd come on the train. There had been talk in the saloon of a reward for anyone who could stir fear enough to bring a troop back to show the flag. A troop meant contracts and pay. Pay meant full pockets, and full pockets warmed certain cold hearts. "There's always someone trying to turn pain into profit," the preacher said. On his way out of town, the rancher stopped at the edge of the stockyard, where an old trapper sat whittling, his hat pulled low. The man had eyes like river stones. He spat and said, "Word is someone fired an arrow with a filed steel head. Not bone, not the old way. That means a man near iron. That means town." The rancher felt the ground shift under the story he had been telling himself. If the wound had come from steel filed in a shop, then the trail of guilt ran both into the hills and back down Main Street. He rode hard for home, the sack of supplies thumping against the saddle. A thin moon rose and turned the snow to tin. At the low pass, he stopped and listened. He heard only wind. When the cabin finally came into view, the riders were silhouettes against the cottonwoods again, patient and dark. He raised the sack high so they could see it. Inside, Tohani slept but stirred at the sound of the door and reached for the token at his neck by reflex. "You left and came back," he said. "I said I would." They drank coffee and shared dried apples. The rancher showed Tohani the steel salve tin, then the filed edge of the arrow he had pulled earlier from the hearth corner where he had thrown it without thought. Tohani looked at it a long time. "Filed clean," he said. "Not a boy's work. A man with a bench and lamp." They sat with that truth, and it dug a new channel for the conflict. This was not a simple river of old hate. Someone had worked to make it flood. Night deepened. The riders lit no fires. They were outlines only, like stones waiting for a thaw. The rancher dozed in a chair and dreamt of a warm table he had not seen in years, of his boy's hands sticky with syrup, of a woman humming a tune that always found the harmony in a hard day. He woke to Tohani trying to rise. "What do you think the test is?" the rancher asked. "Not a trick shot," Tohani answered. "Not a duel. My people do not measure truth with blood spilled fast. They like to see a man stand with his words. Maybe they ask you to walk with us at dawn. Maybe they ask you to let go of your gun. Maybe they ask you to share water." "Water," the rancher repeated, and his jaw tightened. The spring above his pasture was the reason he had chosen this valley. In summer, men drifted through and looked at it the way hungry eyes look at bread. Tohani nodded, reading his face. "A thing shared can save many winters. A thing kept can start a war." The cabin held their fear like smoke. To break it, the rancher told him of the winter he had quit the volunteers. The day he had seen a child with braids crying over a burned toy made of sticks. The way the sound had broken something in his chest and filled the crack with cold that never left. Tohani told him about a sister who had married a soldier and learned to bake bread with white flour, then died of fever before her baby's first summer. "Loss makes a camp of 2 men who were enemies," he said. "It can make a family if they dare it." Near midnight, a new sound crept along the creek. Not horses, men walking, trying to be part of the wind. The rancher lifted his rifle and looked to the window. Tohani's eyes flared. He shook his head and pointed down, then up, then traced a line in the air as if marking a bend. The rancher understood. Whoever was coming was trying to circle, using the cut of the bank and the willows for cover. He slipped out the back with his coat thrown over the rifle to hide its length. The moon had ducked behind cloud, but the snow held luck. He could see the darker shapes moving low along the creek, not the easy silhouettes of riders, but the heavier slog of men in winter boots. A lantern flashed once, then went dark. He knew that lantern's handle, wrapped with a strip of red cloth. He had seen it hanging behind the bar at the saloon. He raised the rifle, then lowered it. A bullet would start a fire that no creek could put out. Instead, he whistled the high, thin call his boy had used to summon the dog years ago. The riders by the trees stirred. In a breath, they were on their ponies, moving like shadows poured downhill. The men in boots froze, surprised by the quick approach. The rancher stayed unseen, watching as the leader slid from his pony and stood with the creek between them. No one raised a gun. No arrow flew. There was only a long exchange of words, the kind that sound like gravel and plea even when you do not know the language. The men from town backed away first. They never looked toward the cabin. When they reached the bend, they ran. The riders did not chase far. The leader came close to the porch and stared at the rancher, who had stepped out with empty hands. No victory flashed on the leader's face, only a question of what kind of man would whistle for help from the very people who might kill him at sunrise. Then he turned and melted back to the cottonwoods, leaving the night to settle again with an even heavier promise. Inside, Tohani's breath had steadied. "You did not shoot," he said. "I thought about what fire does to a dry country," the rancher answered. "Sometimes a spark is worse than a wolf." As dawn hinted at the edge of the sky, a soft stamping sounded near the porch. A small form stood there, thin as wire, a boy of maybe 12 winters with a pony too small for the valley. He wore a hat pulled low and carried a bundle wrapped in burlap. The rancher recognized him. He had seen the boy sweeping the saloon steps, tossing cobs to the swine behind the kitchen, darting through the rail yard for dropped coal. The boy's eyes were wide with fear and importance. "I came early," the boy said, voice shaking. "They paid me to carry messages. Said to tell the deputy if any Indian went past the cottonwoods. But I heard talk about burning a ranch at sunrise to get the troop back out here. I don't want no burning. My ma sleeps in a house with dry straw for a roof." The rancher took the bundle and unwrapped it. Inside lay 2 more filed steel arrowheads and a strip of red cloth like the bar lantern handle. He looked at the boy, at the brave way he forced himself to meet a grown man's eyes. "Go home," the rancher said gently. "Tell your ma you did a good thing. Keep your head down today." When the boy left, Tohani held one of the arrowheads up to the light. "Proof," he said. "Your deputy will not like proof." "Men who like power never do," the rancher answered. Outside, the cottonwood silvered as the eastern rim brightened. The test waited. The riders formed a line, quiet as the morning. The rancher helped Tohani to his feet. He stood hunched but stubborn, a man not yet ready to surrender to the bed. Together they stepped onto the porch. The cold took their breath like a stern teacher. The leader dismounted and crossed the hard snow. He stopped an arm's length away. His face held no insult and no smile. He spoke a few measured words. Tohani translated in a whisper. "He says the valley is a bowl. If one man keeps all the water, many starve. If one man shares, many live. He asks if you will open the spring to their herds at the turn of each season." The rancher stared at the leader, then past him to the line of riders, then to the hill where 2 graves lay under brush. He felt the weight of the question press on every scar in him. The spring was his heart. To open it was to trust men who had every reason to hate him, and whom he had been taught to fear. To refuse it was to keep the peace inside his fence and risk war right beyond it. Tohani swayed beside him but kept his feet. "There is more," he said. "They ask if you will walk with them today to the spring and place your hand in the water while they watch. That is their test. Words can be smoke. Cold water is truth." The rancher looked down at his hands at the old burns and rope lines. He looked at the leader again, at the calm steadiness of a man who had also buried more than he could count. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried as if splitting the day in 2. He did not answer yet. He could feel town pulling from one side and the riders from the other, like 2 teams roped to his chest. He could see the deputy's grin if he heard about this, could see the gambler's quick hands shuffling cards to mark the next play. He could see his wife's photograph watching without judgment, the boy on her lap, forever small. The sun broke the ridge and turned the creek to a strip of bright metal. The leader waited. Tohani waited. The riders did not twitch. The rancher drew a breath that hurt. Then the wind shifted and he caught the sharp, sour scent of lamp oil on the air. It came from the downstream bend, the place where the men from town had tried to creep past in the night. He realized there was a 3rd rope on him too, one pulled by hands that would profit from flames. The test at sunrise was not only about water. It was about whether he would stand with truth against men who dressed lies in uniforms and contracts. He lowered his hand to his side and closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He saw the arrowheads on his table, the red cloth, the boy's thin face, the filed steel that did not belong to this valley's old fights. When he opened his eyes, the light had climbed a finger higher. The leader took one slow step closer. Tohani's breath hitched. In the stillness, the rancher finally spoke, but only 3 words, quiet as the first drip of a thaw. and heavy enough to tip the day toward whatever waited next. The wind had picked up by mid-morning, carrying a strange sound through the valley. It wasn't the low hum of nature or the crack of ice breaking along the creek. It was something sharper, like voices traveling on air, too far to understand but close enough to warn. The rancher stood on the porch beside Tohani, his hand resting near his holster, his eyes fixed on the cottonwoods where the riders waited. The sun was climbing slow and pale, and the frost on the roof began to drip in tiny silver streams. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk cried again, circling over land that seemed to hold its breath. Tohani swayed slightly but stayed on his feet. His face was pale, the wound still angry beneath its bandage, yet there was strength in his stance, a quiet stubbornness that refused to bend even under pain. The rancher studied him for a moment. He could see that same look in the mirror sometimes, the look of a man who'd lost too much to ever kneel again. But what they were facing now wasn't just a test of trust. It was the weight of two worlds colliding on a patch of cold earth. The Apache leader took another slow step forward. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the cabin, the horses, the open plain behind. He said something in his language, low but firm. Tohani answered, his words measured, each one like a stone placed in careful balance. The leader's face hardened. He spoke again, this time louder. Tohani turned to the rancher. He says the time has come. You speak your truth with your hands, not your tongue. He asks you to walk with him to the spring. The rancher looked toward the narrow trail that wound between the rocks. Beyond it, a thin line of water shimmered where the sun touched it. The spring that had fed his cattle and his family for years. If that's what it takes, he said quietly. Tohani's eyes met his. If you go, they may still not believe. If you stay, they will think you hide something. He nodded. I've hidden enough in this life. They started walking, slow and deliberate, through the crusted snow. The air was so still that every footstep sounded like breaking glass. The Apache riders followed in silence, forming a loose half-circle around them. Their ponies moved without a sound, their breath steaming through the cold. The leader walked ahead, his shadow long and sharp on the ground. Halfway to the spring, the rancher glanced back toward the cabin. From this distance, it looked small, fragile even, like it wouldn't survive one more season of wind. Yet it held everything he still cared about. The memory of his wife, the resting place of his son, the life he had built from pain and solitude. He thought of the lamp oil smell from earlier, the warning that men from town might still be nearby. If someone tried to start trouble now, this fragile piece could burn faster than dry grass. When they reached the spring, the leader motioned for him to stop. The water glimmered in the hollow, clear and cold. He said something again, softer now, and gestured toward the surface. Tohani translated, his voice steady. He says this land remembers what men do. If you touch this water with a clean heart, it will show. If you lie, it will turn dark. The rancher looked down at the reflection trembling in the water. His face stared back, lined, weathered, older than he remembered. He knelt slowly, feeling every ache in his body. He thought of his wife's laughter, his boy chasing calves through the pasture, the years he spent carrying hate like it was a badge of honor. He reached his hand toward the spring, but before his fingers touched the surface, a gunshot cracked through the valley. The sound was so sudden it split the world in two. The horses reared, the riders shouted, and a flock of crows burst from the trees in a black wave. The rancher hit the ground, grabbing his rifle by instinct. Tohani stumbled beside him, clutching his wound. Smoke drifted from the ridge to the east, thin but unmistakable. Someone was firing from the rocks above. Another shot rang out, hitting close enough to kick up dirt by the leader's feet. The Apache riders scattered for cover, their movements quick and trained. The leader shouted orders, pointing toward the ridge. The rancher scanned the hill through the haze, his heart pounding. He caught a glint of metal between two boulders, the shine of a rifle barrel in sunlight. Stay down, he barked to Tohani. They're not your men! I know, Tohani said, his voice tight with pain. Your deputy. I see his coat. The rancher's stomach dropped. He squinted harder, and sure enough, a familiar tan coat flickered between the rocks. He could almost hear the deputy's mocking voice. Just one spark, old man. That's all it takes. Another shot whistled past, grazing the trunk beside him. The leader's men fired back now, arrows cutting through the air, but the shooters had cover and height. The sound of bullets hitting stone echoed through the valley. The spring water rippled violently, blood-red dust falling from the bank. The rancher crawled behind a fallen log, trying to get a clearer shot. He'd seen this kind of setup before, a staged attack meant to turn peace into chaos. The deputy wanted the Apaches blamed, wanted a reason for soldiers to march in again. War brought business, and dead men couldn't talk about who lit the fire. He found his mark through the rifle's sight and fired once. The shot cracked sharp and clean, hitting the rock near the deputy's shoulder. The man ducked, cursing, then waved for the others to pull back. Two figures retreated down the slope, their boots kicking snow, but one stayed behind, crouched low, aiming at the riders below. The rancher's heart raced. "They're setting up to shoot the chief," he hissed. Tohani tried to stand, but the pain dropped him to his knees. "You must stop it," he gasped. The rancher nodded. He broke from cover, sprinting across the clearing toward the spring. Bullets tore the ground behind him. The Apache leader saw him running and froze, confusion flashing across his face. Then the rancher shoved him hard to the side as a shot cracked. The bullet struck the rock where the leader's head had been. The leader looked at him, stunned, and for a moment, all the tension of the last days shifted. Enemy and ally standing in the same light, both realizing they were being played. Tohani's voice rose behind them, shouting in his native tongue, words that carried across the valley. The riders turned their aim toward the ridge, loosing arrows in quick rhythm. One found its mark. The rifleman fell from his perch, tumbling down the slope into the brush. Silence followed, thick and uneasy. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. The rancher lowered his rifle slowly, his breath ragged. The leader stood beside him, his face still unreadable. "Your men?" he asked in broken English. The rancher shook his head. "Not mine. Yours neither. Just men who don't want peace." The leader looked toward the ridge where the body lay half buried in snow. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he turned back to the spring. "Still you must finish," he said. "Water waits for truth." The rancher hesitated. The spring no longer looked calm. It was cloudy, rippling with dirt and smoke. But he walked to it again, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. He knelt and reached out. His fingers touched the surface. The water was ice cold, biting his skin like truth itself. He left his hand there, open, steady. Behind him, Tohani watched, breathing shallow. The riders stood silent, their bows lowered. The leader stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the rancher's hand. The water cleared slowly, the dirt settling. The sun broke through the clouds, catching on the surface, turning it gold. Then came the sound no one expected, the faint echo of boots behind the cabin. The rancher froze. More men were coming from the opposite side of the valley. The deputy's voice carried low and cruel. "Drop the gun, old man. Step away from the savages!" The leader's men tensed again. Arrows knocked. Tohani struggled to his feet, gripping the wall of the cabin. The rancher turned toward the sound, his heart hammering. He saw 5 men advancing, 2 locals, 1 gambler from town, and the deputy at the front, holding a lantern of oil. The deputy sneered. "You really thought you'd make peace with devils? You just gave me the reason I needed." He dropped the lantern. Flames caught the dry grass near the trail, spreading fast with the wind. The Apache riders shouted, scattering toward the stream. Smoke curled through the air, black and hungry. The fire crept toward the cabin, toward the graves beyond the hill. The rancher raised his rifle. "Put it out," he warned. The deputy laughed. "This land needs cleansing. Fire's the only thing that tells the truth." The leader drew his knife, ready to charge, but the rancher stopped him. "No," he said softly. "This is my fight now." The deputy cocked his revolver. The wind whipped the fire higher. The 2 men stared across the smoke-filled space, history and hate standing between them like a line in the dirt. Somewhere behind, Tohani shouted something the rancher couldn't hear, his voice swallowed by the roar of the flames. The horses cried. The air turned to heat and ash. The rancher's finger tightened on the trigger. The deputy raised his gun, and for a split second the world went completely still, caught between mercy and revenge, between the past and what came next. The deputy's revolver glinted as he leveled it across the smoke. His voice carried a cruel certainty, a tone of a man who had already decided who would live and who would burn. The rancher held steady, his rifle aimed but his mind racing faster than the flames crawling through the grass. The air between them shimmered with heat, the smell of burning earth mixing with the bitter scent of oil. Behind him, the wounded Apache and the riders stood still, caught in that thin moment when one wrong move could turn the valley into a graveyard for everyone. Then the deputy fired. The shot tore through the haze, echoing across the creek. The rancher felt it whistle past his shoulder and hit the log behind him. He fired back, hitting the lantern in the deputy's hand. It shattered, spilling fire across his coat. The deputy dropped to one knee, cursing as flames climbed up his sleeve. His men panicked, stumbling back as the grass around them caught. One of them tried to stamp it out, Another fled toward the ridge. The leader of the Apache raised his hand, motioning his riders to hold. The rancher lowered his rifle slowly. The deputy rolled in the dirt, choking on smoke, until one of his men pulled him clear and threw snow over the fire on his arm. His gun was gone, and the fight drained out of him with the smoke. When he looked up again, his face was red and streaked with soot, his eyes full of hate and shame. "You're finished," the rancher said, his voice rough but calm. "You tried to start a war that was already over." The deputy coughed hard. "You don't understand," he rasped. "Peace doesn't pay. Fear keeps men working, keeps money flowing. Fear's burned enough," the rancher cut in. "It burned my family, it burned your soul, and it nearly burned this valley." He stepped closer, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. The deputy didn't move. Behind him, his men looked away, unwilling to stand beside a man exposed for what he was. The leader of the Apache approached quietly, his knife still in hand but his expression calm. He looked from the rancher to the deputy, then to the spring where the water still shimmered through the smoke. "Let him live," the leader said in halting English. "Let him watch what truth builds when hate dies." The deputy glared up, his pride still clinging to whatever dignity he thought he had. "You think this changes anything?" "You think they'll let your kind stay?" The rancher turned to the leader. "He's not wrong. Men in town won't understand. They'll want someone to blame for the shots fired." The leader nodded once. "Then we tell the right story, together." They spent the rest of that day putting out what the deputy had started. The Apache riders worked beside the rancher, beating at the flames with blankets and shoveling snow over the burning brush. Smoke rolled through the trees like ghosts leaving the valley. By sundown, the fire was dead. The grass blackened in long streaks that still smelled of ruin. Tohani collapsed near the spring, his strength finally gone, but his face carried peace. The leader knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his shoulder. "He spoke for mercy," he said quietly. "He spoke for you." The rancher crouched down beside them, handing Tohani water from the spring. "You saved more than my life," he said. "You saved my soul." Tohani gave a faint smile. Then the fire had meaning. His hand slipped from the cup, the last of his breath leaving with the sigh of the evening wind. The leader closed his eyes, murmuring words that the rancher didn't understand but somehow felt deep in his chest. When the last light faded, the rancher helped bury Tohani near the creek. The leader placed a carved stone over the mound, tying it with a strip of leather from his own belt. "He walks with the river now," he said. The deputy and his men were gone by morning, leaving their burned camp and empty shells behind. The rancher didn't chase them. He knew the law would find them soon enough, and this time the story would travel differently. The town had seen enough of blood to know where truth lived. In the days that followed, the valley settled again. The snow melted slowly, revealing green beneath the ash. The spring ran clearer than it had in years. The Apache stayed for a short time, helping repair the fence line and rebuild the shed that the fire had scorched. The rancher worked beside them in silence, a quiet understanding growing between men who had once looked at each other through gun sights. When the work was done, the leader came to him one last time. They stood near the graves behind the cabin, the rancher's wife and boy beside the new stone for Tohani. "Your land has a scar," the leader said. "But scars remember lessons," the rancher nodded. "And they don't fade easy." The leader handed him a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside was the token Tohani had once offered, the woven beads and sinew charm. "Keep this," the leader said. "For peace." The rancher closed his hand around it. "You have my spring when you need it. Every season," the leader smiled faintly. "Then the earth will heal." He mounted his horse and the riders turned toward the horizon. Before leaving, the leader looked back once. "You shared your fire," he said. "Now the sun will share its light." The rancher watched until they vanished into the far hills. The valley was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. The silence now carried meaning, like the pause between heartbeats rather than the absence of them. He stood for a while by the spring, watching the water shimmer under the rising sun. It seemed clearer than ever, as if the earth itself had been waiting for forgiveness. Days turned into weeks. The snow gave way to soft grass, and the burned line along the creek began to green again. The rancher fixed the roof, rebuilt the corral, and carved a small bench from a fallen log near the graves. Sometimes at dusk, he'd sit there holding the token and listening to the wind through the trees. It no longer sounded lonely. It sounded alive. One afternoon, a rider came from town, a young boy with wide eyes and a folded paper in his hand. He was the same boy who had warned him before. "Sheriff sent this," he said, handing it over. Says the deputy's gone. Took the gambler and skipped south. Folks are saying you stopped something worse. The rancher took the note, reading the rough scrawl. Peace holds in the valley. Town owes you a debt. He folded it without a word. Thank you, son, he said. You keep out of trouble, the boy grinned. Guess trouble doesn't like coming here no more. That night, the rancher lit his lantern and sat by the window. Outside, the moon laid a silver trail across the spring. The cabin walls glowed softly, and for the first time in years he felt warmth that wasn't born from fire. He thought of the people who had passed through this land, his wife, his boy, Tohani, and all those buried beneath the hills. He thought of how hate had nearly turned the earth to ash again, and how a moment of mercy had changed everything. The days that followed became quieter but full of purpose. The rancher began clearing the lower fields, planting oats near the waterline. One morning he saw movement along the ridge, 3 Apache riders watching from a distance. They didn't wave, but they didn't hide either. One of them lifted a hand briefly, a silent promise that peace still lived between them. He nodded back, tipping his hat. As spring turned to summer, travelers passed through and spoke of the valley as a place spared by miracle. Some called it the Valley of Fire's Mercy. The rancher never corrected them. He just said, "Sometimes mercy comes wearing the face of a man you once called your enemy." Years later, when the grass grew tall over Tohani's resting place and the sound of the creek was softer, the rancher grew old, but never left. Folks in town said he'd changed, that the hard man who once rode with vengeance now spoke little but always helped a stranger on the road. They said if you came to his cabin hungry, he'd share his fire before asking your name. On his final summer, he sat again by the spring, the token still around his wrist, its beads worn smooth. The sun was setting low over the hills, painting everything gold. He watched the water glimmer and thought of the day it had once turned dark with smoke, and how it had cleared again. He smiled faintly, whispering into the breeze, "We made it right after all." When the wind shifted, it carried the scent of pine and river, familiar, peaceful, alive. The valley had healed, and so had he. The fire that once divided men had finally become the light that bound them. And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the last thing that lingered over the land was not hate, not loss, but the quiet, steady breath of forgiveness.